Think about it. Feedback is everywhere in our lives. In our professional lives, of course, that's why we're here right now. But it's also there in our personal lives. And no matter where we are, personal or professional, we're always giving and we're always receiving feedback. So today, one of my goals for you is to recognize that we are both always giving and receiving feedback, and that feedback is a two-way street. This morning at 8, I met with many of your trainees, and that was the message that they got. So the message that you're going to receive today is somewhat parallel. What I was saying is that feedback is a two-way street. We're constantly giving and receiving feedback in our personal and professional lives. And I met with some of the trainees, some of your trainees this morning, and gave them that very message. And in fact, the message that I will give you today is also very similar with a few added details. The learning objectives for today's session include distinguishing feedback from evaluation. Then I'm going to give you some strategies for not only giving effective feedback, but also for receiving effective feedback. And perhaps as educators and as faculty member, we may think more about giving the feedback and less about receiving the feedback. But I would argue that paying attention to reception of feedback is very important, not only for us as feedback receivers, but also for the people we're sending the feedback to. And we will review some feedback delivery methods. So I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about here on this slide. We've got ACGME, LCME, AACN, maintenance of certification. All of these bodies basically have competencies that have been described, be it as an EPA, as a milestone, as a part of a maintenance of certification. And today's learners are learning in the setting of competency-based education models. So what is that? Well, if we think of a competency-based education model and compare that to a traditional model, in the traditional model, we really focus on what is being taught and how we're teaching it. And notice when I said the what and the how, I didn't talk about the learner. That's kind of important. That learner is key and integral to the learning process. The competency-based education model focuses on the learner and puts the learner in the center. And this is accomplished by essentially elaborating outcomes and using assessment to do that. So within the competency-based model, our learners learn to learn using the self-regulated learning model. And you can see that this can be broken down into 4 different acts. There's planning, learning, assessment, and then adjustment. And for this session, I'm really going to focus on assessment only. If in the next session, if you stay for the next session beginning at 1, we'll focus on both assessment and adjustment in more detail. So let's look more and consider more about assessment. When we think about assessment, there are really 2 ways of assessment in the self-regulated learning model. So we have internal assessment, which is self-assessment, and we have external assessment, which is essentially feedback. And that's why we're here today, for feedback, to learn about feedback. What do we know about physicians, health professions educators, and we can even extrapolate that to adults in general about our ability to self-assess? Well, it's summarized on this slide here, and you can see that physicians have limited ability to accurately self-assess. So this is definitely problematic for an educator to see and hear. And if you look at the bottom point here, which is the most confident are the weakest self-assessors. So the people who are performing at the lowest in their class are often the most confident. And so that gap between their confidence and their ability is largest in that group. And those are the learners that we have to find, we have to identify, because those are the ones who are potentially a danger to our patients. Those are the scary learners. We have to find them. So, self-assessment is problematic. Enter external assessment, i.e. feedback. I like to think of feedback kind of as the check and balance of the whole self-regulated learning cycle. So this is the way that we can provide information to our learners and hopefully help them to diminish that gap for those of our learners who have a large gap. We would like to bring their perception with reality closer together. So in 1983, Jack Endy published this landmark article in JAMA. And I consider this a really high-yield paper. So if you walk out of here wanting more and wanting to read something that's high-yield, easy to digest, and something that you can repurpose very quickly, this is the paper. So go to Google, type in Endy, E-N-D-E, and JAMA, and you will find the article. This article has been cited well over 800 times in the medical literature. Again, it was published in '83. Prior to 1983, this is how much was in the medical literature on feedback. Zero. So Dr. Endy realized, he's an internist, and he realized that he was giving feedback to residents, and he wanted to learn more about giving feedback. He wanted to further develop this skill. So he, of course, went to the literature first and found the goose egg, and then decided, okay, I've got to turn somewhere else. So he turned to other areas and then essentially wrote this landmark article. So the importance of feedback, he states, this is a direct quote, "Without feedback, mistakes go uncorrected. Good performance is not reinforced, and clinical competence is achieved empirically or not at all." That is very true, and it's very scary. And I urge you to remember this, and remember this vis-a-vis what I said about the kitten seeing the lion. We cannot self-assess, okay? So feedback is a must in medical education. Let's now think about feedback versus evaluation. What are the differences between the two? Feedback is formative. I like to think of feedback as tiny grains of sand that represent little bits of information that accumulate in a pile. And as the pile accumulates, we get a better picture of a person's performance. So these tiny grains of sand, or these tiny pieces of information, nuggets of information, should be given in a timely fashion. So very either during the learning moment or very proximate to the learning moment. We shouldn't wait, weeks afterwards to say, hey, do you remember when we were seeing that patient and you said this? Well, I've been thinking about that now for 2 weeks and I wanted to tell you about that. Because chances are the learner has no idea what you're talking about. We should be descriptive when we're giving feedback. So what I like to do is imagine as if, when I'm giving feedback, imagine as if I am watching a movie and I'm describing merely what I see in this movie. And if you do that, it kind of divorces the emotions to some extent and allows you to really just focus and hone on your observing skills. So it's non-judgmental. We're not going to say, great job, good work, keep it up, outstanding, that was awful, terrible, we need to talk. Because that kind of language is evaluative. The neat thing about feedback is that it fosters learning. So we're giving these nuggets of information, these grains of sand are happening just in time in a learning moment, so that if I'm seeing a series of several patients in a clinic in one given day, I can give my resident or my fellows a specific piece of feedback on patient 1 and say, now when we see the next patient, I want you to try this. And then we can observe that, and then we can give some more specific feedback so that we're fostering learning around a specific piece of information. And in doing so, provide opportunities for improvement. Most importantly, feedback is informal. And I think that this is something that we all have to remember, is this is a very informal process. So these are just little tweaks along the way. Evaluation. Evaluation is essentially the opposite of what I just described. And you can read on the slide, it's summative. So evaluation is a snapshot of a learner's performance during some period of time. Very different from feedback. We're making a judgment, we're providing a final assessment, and this is high stakes, frequently becoming part of our learners' permanent records. Feedback versus evaluation. So today, I'm focusing on feedback. Now, if we are providing feedback, as we should, and we're giving our learners all of those grains of sand and giving them opportunity to see snapshots of themselves, by the time they come to their evaluation, they will not feel like this poor cat who is potentially about to meet its demise. So we have to provide that information so that when it's time for the evaluation, our learners understand where we're coming from a snapshot point of view.
The mic up even higher. Here, this one. They're having a real hard time hearing at the back. Everybody wants to hear you. There you go.
Okay.
Is that better?
Hello? Better?
Back there, is that better?
I see a thumbs up. Okay. I'll look back there. If we're still having problems, give me a signal, okay? Thank you. So what is feedback? If you look to the medical literature, there are all sorts of different definitions of feedback in the medical literature. I have selected 2. The first one is one that was written by Dr. Indy, who is pictured here. And he's, of course, the one who authored the landmark paper I described earlier. And he says that feedback is information that describes a student's performance in a given activity that is intended to guide future performance. Information that we give to a learner. Another definition is one offered by Valerie Shute, and she says that feedback is information communicated to the learner intended to modify thinking or behavior for the purposes of learning. Again, information that we give to a learner. Think about that. That is very unidirectional. It's us saying blah, 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 blah to them. Now think about your interpersonal reactions, both professionally and on a personal level. That seems counterintuitive, that we're just going to have this unidirectional exchange and expect this to be effective. So, I'm a pathologist, you all heard that. I can never forget about my microscope. So when I think about this, I of course have to think about it from a microscopic point of view. So my 4x point of view is here. That's low power. So we think about the learner, the educator, and the environment, specifically the interpersonal environment that we are establishing. And this is a different way of thinking about feedback. And in fact, we can now think about feedback being a two-way street. And the first mention of this concept in the medical literature was in 2009 by Bing Yu. And then in 2015, early 2015, Telio et al. Described the concept of an educational alliance. So what is this? For the psychologists and the psychiatrists in the room, this may sound very familiar because what they did is they borrowed the concept of a therapeutic alliance and repurposed it for the purposes of medical education and health professions education. Before we look more into this educational alliance that you're going to be so excited to go start forging once you leave here, let's think about our learners. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten involved in discussions about millennials and, oh, the millennials that, oh, the millennials this, oh my goodness, they're so different, we're so different. So I thought it might be useful for us to think about the millennials a little bit. Who are they? Who are they vis-a-vis us and our own generations? All of this information is taken from the Pew Social Trends. So if you're interested, you can go and look at all of that information online. So this timeline delineates the various generations, and interestingly, people who are considered to be within the millennial generation were born in 1981 to 1996. And they are, in general, our learners that we're working with. I saw this and I thought that this was important for us to see today together. In this survey, respondents were asked, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? So this is the percent of people who say that most people can be trusted. And you can see that the millennial generation feels very differently than the other generations. So they're less trusting of others. So something to keep in mind when you're dealing with a millennial learner. Facebook and number of friends. How many people, how many of us are in Facebook? Self-disclosure, I'll tell you, I'm not. So therefore, I have 0 friends. For those people who do have Facebook, what you can see is that as people become younger and younger, they have more and more Facebook friends. So our millennial generation is very involved in social media and friending. I like this one too. When is it okay to use a cell phone? And you'll see here, during class or lecture, our millennial colleagues say, 22% say, yeah, it's fine, go ahead, sure, why not? I would say no, but that's just me. So now, millennials and feedback. As I was preparing to come here for my visit, I was speaking with Dr. Wicker, and she and I were saying, well, it would be so great to find some information on millennials and feedback and how much feedback they want, because there's this perception that they want a lot of feedback. And part of that perception, I think, is because they were raised with internet. So they're used to this instant gratification, and they're used to this instant feedback, if you will, that the internet has given them. When I look to the medical literature to see if I can find this in some kind of table or numeric form, it's not there. No one has done this study yet that at least I could find. So for right now, I had to basically resort to Dr. Google, and still I couldn't find that data. So there is no data there. There's, as I said, a perception that millennials want increased feedback, but increased relative to what? Do they want more feedback than I want as a Gen Xer? Do they want more feedback than, say, a baby boomer does? I don't know. I think that would be something interesting to consider, though. And then finally, this is a fun thing. And if you want to get your phone out and do this, I won't be offended. So there is a quiz, and you can go to Google and Google "How Millennial Are You?" It's a 15-question quiz. It's super easy. And what it will do is give you a score. You can see my score there. I scored 79, so I feel really cool. But I will tell you that this is not a validated educational tool. It's all about fun. So now back to the Educational Alliance. So before I digressed into the millennial learner discussion, I had introduced the concept of an educational alliance. So an educational alliance is similar, the concept is similar to that of a therapeutic alliance. And what Telio et al. State is that as educators, we should strive to establish relationships with our learners that is built on negotiation and dialogue, and that this is an educational relationship. And so I think just by definition, the word relationship suggests that there's some kind of longevity or ongoing nature to this. And within this relationship, we are seeking a shared understanding, we're negotiating, and we're working together. And as a result of that dialogue, negotiation, creating these shared goals and working together, we're creating opportunities for feedback. In order to do this, there has to be a reasonable interpersonal environment. And Bing Yu looked at this. He wanted to know what are the features of an interpersonal environment that help land feedback, if you will. And these are the three things that were identified. Number one, source credibility. So that means the learner's perception of your ability to give feedback based on your years of experience, your expertise, your knowledge of the specific subject area. So for example, if you're in your first year out as faculty, perhaps the feedback that you give to your fellow may not be as well received as, say, someone like me who's been out for 10 years. They might believe me a little more, or maybe want to discount the information more readily from the version of me that was from only 1 year out. So source credibility is exquisitely important. Next is beneficence. So we need to demonstrate to our learners that the reason why we are engaging in this feedback conversation is because we care. And we care about them, and we care about seeing them move along the continuum from incompetent to competent. And we care about our patients. They need to know that. They need to feel that. If they don't feel it, and if it's not there, your feedback will not land. And then finally, a perceived alignment. So show them that you want to work with them, that you want to help establish learning goals and help them reach their learning goals. Now, as I said, not all feedback lands. And there was a paper that was written by Volosky et al., published in Medical Teacher, and it's actually part of the series of Best Evidence in Medical Education. So this is the AKA BME, this is BME Guide 7. And what they found in this literature review is that of all the studies that they included in their review, 74% of the studies were able to demonstrate a positive impact based on feedback. That's great, but that also means that almost a quarter of them, more than a quarter of them, were not able to demonstrate that, and that the feedback didn't land. And if we look at characteristics associated with a positive impact, source, so again, going back to those three things I just mentioned, and duration. So that's why I'm trying to make you understand that these educational alliances, these ongoing discussions that we have with our learners is key. Now that can certainly be a challenge when we think about this as medical educators and our curriculum structure, because sometimes our residents are only with us for a couple days or a couple weeks at a time, and then they disappear for months at a time, depending upon the structure and what kind of program you're in. So that's certainly a challenge. This is something that I really hit home with our learners this morning, the concept of humility. And this is a paper that was written by Dr. Gruppin, who's out of University of Michigan. And this is, I think, really quite elegant. And what he says is this, that as educators and in health professions education, we need to remain humble. And when we are remaining humble, we need to be open to the idea that we, as educators, we as learners, are fallible, that we're not perfect, that we do make mistakes, that we have to ask for help, that we all need feedback, and that we can all possibly benefit from changes. I think this is really quite beautiful. And I bring this to you today as educators because if we're expecting our learners to embody this, then we too have to embody this. We too have to come with this attitude to feedback and to medicine. One example, I'll just tell you a personal anecdote that I do, is as a pathologist we do correlations between different specimens in anatomic pathology, cytology and histology. And many of the faculty members will review these cytology, histology cases in their offices alone after the residents have gone home or after the fellow has gone home. Not me. I review it with my trainees. And we talk about the cases, and we talk about why is there this discrepancy? Is this discrepancy really here? Is this a sampling issue? Is this a diagnostic error? How can we learn from this? And I think if you are open to the idea of talking about the fact that we're not perfect, then it shows them that they can be too. Back to my microscope. So the 4-ax low power view. Learner, educator, and environment. These are the basic components. Now if we go on higher magnification, you can see that this is far more complex than what I'm leading you on to believe. So another piece of the environment that we have to consider in feedback is the physical environment. So think about where you are, literally, and what your message is going to be. If you're in an elevator or in a hallway or in a patient's room, the information that you describe to your trainee is going to be far different than if you are in your office with the door closed and a box of tissues, right? That's kind of important, and sometimes we are so rushed because we have patients stacked up in clinic, or we know we have to do 3 procedures today and I don't have the time, and so we don't think about this. We fail to think about this, and this is a very critical component of the environment, and if you don't consider this, then your feedback isn't going to land. It's going to hit the floor. Learning goals. Within the feedback relationship, you want to work with your learner to establish learning goals. You're going to use the feedback guidelines. Well, that's great. What are the guidelines? So today, I'm going to give you strategies for not only giving feedback, but also for receiving feedback. So the guidelines will be used twice. And then also, you're going to help your learners make a learning plan. One of the problems that we have as educators, and this is well documented within the literature, is that there is a disconnect between the amount of feedback that we as educators say we are giving, right? I see heads nodding. And the amount of feedback that our learners say they are receiving. Why is this? Well, I don't know that we know that there is one universal answer, but potentially one solution is that we're not labeling our feedback as such. And this is an easy fix. So if you are going to give feedback, when you're going to give feedback, just look at your learner and say, I'd like to give you some feedback now. Is that okay? Is this a good time? Let's do some feedback. Let's do it. It's Feedback Friday. You know, whatever you want to do. One of my residents told me about at their prior institution, they had Feedback Friday. So I mean, you can create whatever culture you want here, but the idea is to work to create a culture of feedback and label it as such so that we're all aware when feedback is happening. And that's why I started my talk with the whole, think about it, feedback is happening all the time. It really is, and it's only when you become open and mindful to the idea that you are giving and receiving feedback that you begin to see it more and more in life. As I said, teacher and learner need to be allies with common goals. So we need to work to establish these educational alliances, and within those alliances, establish learning goals. Always provide feedback in a timely and expected way. So if our trainees don't seem like they are ready to have a serious discussion, that's okay. That's okay. We all know that we're not always ready to have serious discussions all the time. And perhaps the best thing to do is to pause, take a moment to collect yourself, or allow the learner to collect him or herself, and then reassess to see if it's a good time. And then always base feedback on direct observation. Feedback should be focused on specific behaviors, not the person. So as I said, think about what you're seeing as a movie and then describe it as such, essentially. Don't criticize the person. Don't say you. That's not going to work very well. Feedback should always be descriptive, constructive, and not judgmental. And here's one that I really like. Include positive behaviors. And I put this here because some people have a tendency to include only the negatives, and some people have the opposite problem, which is to only include the positives. And I think that's probably what happens more frequently, is when we're giving feedback, we just say, oh, you did this well, I saw this, blah, blah, blah. And all the feedback ends up being positive. So why would we do that? Yeah, I heard two great answers. Because it's easy, number one. Yes, that's very easy. You don't have to worry about the tissues coming out. You don't have to worry about your wristwatch and the time ticking away. And you want to be liked. You want to be liked. So what you have to realize is that sometimes it's okay if you're not liked. And that's a hard role as an educator for us to take on, because we all do want to be liked, right? We all want to be liked as humans, as educators. But we're not doing our learners favors by doing this. So we have to sometimes have these hard discussions. Regulate the quantity. We can only hear so much until we just kind of shut down and we say enough. It's kind of like, when a patient receives bad news. You all are familiar with those concepts. They can only take so much information, and in bite-sized pieces of information. So same idea, I think, applies here. Limit feedback to behaviors that are amenable to change. Start with standard language. So here's a great thing that I do. And what I do is I anchor my feedback. I start by anchoring my feedback language in milestones. And this is one that I use a lot because I have a busy F&A service. And I want my trainees to be able to anticipate the needs of the team and assist without being prompted to do so. And you can see that that's a level 3. So I get my trainees to a level 3 pretty quickly. So what you do is start with this standard language and then paint in the details afterwards. I find this to be very useful. Here's a feedback toolbox that I have loaded for you all today. And the methods that I selected are, I think, pretty easy, pretty quick to learn. You can walk out of here remembering what I said about them and start practicing them. I'm not saying you're going to be an expert, because I think giving feedback is always, it's an art, and I think we're always practicing, to be honest. So in the toolbox we have the sandwich, Pendleton, 1-minute preceptor, and SOAP. How many of you are familiar with feedback sandwich? Yeah, okay, so next slide. This is pretty obvious. So positive, constructive, positive. One of the issues with the feedback sandwich is this. This is one of the problems. And so there are two ways that we could look at this, excuse me, depending upon your learner. Okay, some learners are overconfident. So guess what they're going to hear? The buns Oh, sorry. The buns. They're going to hear the buns. So they're going to hear, message received, I'm awesome. Now, a different kind of learner who's self-critical is going to walk away and hear the meat. And they're going to walk out thinking this, which is suboptimal. So that's the danger in this. I think, it's a great way to start. And you can obviously gauge your interaction because you're doing this in your educational alliance now. And so you can use the method and change the method as you see fit based on how the feedback is landing. Pendleton's method. Pendleton's method is also fairly structured, and it elicits positives and negatives just like the sandwich. But instead of us providing the detail, what we do is we ask the learner to tell us what he or she thinks she did well. And then we have a discussion about that. And then move forward and repeat this whole process with areas for improvement. The 1-minute preceptor is something I am very willing to bet that many of us in this room are doing intuitively without really realizing it. And that is, you get a commitment. So here's a real life example. I do this at the microscope with my fellows and residents and medical students all the time. We look at a cervix biopsy and I say, what's your diagnosis? And my resident or fellow may say, well, Dr. Bean, I think this is invasive squamous cell carcinoma. And I say, wow, really? This person's going to have a rad hist now. Are you sure about that? So I'm probing for supportive evidence. And then I listen to what they say, and based on the information and the knowledge and where they're coming from, I then teach the general principles that can help them arrive at what I perceive to be the accurate diagnosis. And then eventually I will do the great reveal and say, yes, I agree. This is invasive squamous cell carcinoma. This is not HSIL, this is not LSIL, this is not adenocarcinoma, it's not AIS. And we talk about the reasons why. How many of you have heard of this before? This is great, yeah. So if you haven't heard of it, as I said, my guess is that most everyone is doing this intuitively. It's nice just to see it on a roadmap. SOAP. This method is a method that was described by Lisa Howley out of the Carolinas Hospital in Charlotte. And I like this method because it is useful for delivering very serious feedback, and it has a built-in method for making sure that the feedback is landing, which is the asking for understanding. So if you're having a serious feedback session and you need to make sure that they understand what you're telling them, this is the method to use. So you start with self-reflection, ask the learner about why you're here or what they think about subject X, provide them objective feedback around it, and then this is the critical step. Ask the learner to summarize what they've heard so far. And in that one moment when they're telling you and parroting back the conversation, you will know whether or not they understand why you're here and what you're talking about. And then this also has a plan for follow-up, which I think in these situations and these settings is very critical. So here's your toolbox that I have armed you with. The sandwich, Pendleton, SOAP, and the 1-minute preceptor. There are all sorts of different methods out there that have been described. And we can go on and on ad nauseum about all sorts of different methods. But I think if you use the guidelines and do so in the confines of the Educational Alliance, you'll be well served. So another thing to consider is that we don't always, we feel like we don't have time to give feedback. But I would tell you that we actually do have time. Branch et al. Published a paper in 2002, and in it they described 3 different types of feedback: brief, formal, and major. And most of the time we are giving this brief type of feedback. So these are just little, as I said, grains of sand, pieces of information that we're using to change very subtly, sometimes even, a learner's behavior. We can also give formal feedback, which happens following observations. It can be 5 to 20 minutes long. And then finally, major feedback. And major feedback is something that happens kind of at the rotation midpoint. So this is a technique or a type of feedback that you can use when you want to give someone kind of a middle of the road evaluation, not evaluation, but let them know where they are and essentially give them information on where they need to be for their evaluation, their endpoint evaluation. So we've looked at the 4DX view of components of effective feedback, and I've given you the guidelines for giving feedback. Now let's look at receiving feedback. So how do you receive feedback? I don't know. It depends upon the context. Depends upon who you're talking to, right? Sometimes you're happy, sometimes indifferent, sometimes no way. So I remind you that feedback really is a gift. And the more you are able to think of feedback as a gift and frame the conversation in light of feedback being a gift and being a learning opportunity, not only for yourself when you're receiving feedback, but also for your learner when they're receiving feedback, the better the feedback will land and stick and be useful. I put this picture here because this is the same picture I used on the humility slide. And I think that it bears repeating. We need to come at this with humility. We need to be humble. And so I remind you the words of Dr. Gruppen. He said that we have to remember that we're not perfect, that we all make mistakes, that we all need help, we all need feedback, and we all can improve something. And I think that if we come to this with that in mind, that makes us better. It makes us better for ourselves as individual professionals. It makes us better for our learners. And more importantly, it makes us better for our patients. So if you are in a situation where you're receiving feedback, and the person giving you feedback isn't giving you much structure, this is what you can do. You can help them provide structure to your feedback and make it more helpful by telling them what your goals are. So tell them what your goals are, share them with the person giving you feedback, and then with that person, develop a learning plan. So you're essentially forging the educational alliance for yourself. And I think that's okay. And I told your learners that's okay too.
What's an example of sharing with them some learning goals that you have for yourself?
Yeah, so the question is, what's an example of sharing some learning goals that you have for yourself? I'll tell the same story that I told this morning, which is a really good one. In pathology, we rotate with our residents essentially on a weekly basis. And, I don't know, over a year ago, I gave some version of this talk to my residents, fellows, faculty, staff, educators, etc., which was a Friday. And that Sunday night, I checked my email, my Duke email, and there was an email from my first year resident who was going to sign out GYN cases with me. That means look at GYN cases with me on Monday. Dear Dr. Bean, I am so excited to be signing out GYN with you. I have been on GYN 3 times before, and this is what I would like to work on this week. And he outlined in bullet point form specific things that he wanted me to help him learn. So it doesn't get better than that. And I would say that that is where we want our learners to be. I was so impressed. I printed the email and ran to the program director and said, look at this, this is terrific. So what he and I did during that week was we started with that email that I printed, and I assessed his ability based on his learning goals. And I said, okay, I think this one is terrific. You don't need to work on this one. Let's consider adding this as an additional learning goal. What do you think about that? And so what we did was we were able to move him along, and in doing so, develop a learning plan by starting with those goals. when you're in the moment and when you're receiving feedback, there are a few things you can do. The first is listen. So just listen to understand. Turn off your inner voice, your inner critic, and just listen. And I know that's really difficult. It can be very difficult depending upon the context. But the more you can do that, the better you will be. As you're listening, be actively involved. Don't be afraid to contribute to the conversation if you're receiving this feedback. If you don't understand what you're being told, that's okay. You can respectfully say, wow, I'm having trouble understanding exactly what you mean here. Can you give me some more information or provide a specific example to illuminate this idea? Seek clarification when necessary. Easier said than done. Try to control your defensive behavior. We all have those defensive behaviors where the walls come up and we really just don't want to hear what people have to say. So the more that you can be mindful of how you react in a feedback receiving situation, the better you yourself will be at receiving feedback. Now, I'll give you a personal anecdote. I'm really into fitness. That's one of my hobbies. I love to go to the gym, and I've been doing this with a trainer now for a full year. And when I first started, the trainer would say, no, do this, do that. This is wrong. You need to fix this, fix that. And at first I thought, really? I thought I was pretty good, you know? And then at some point along the way, I realized, no, she's telling me these things because she doesn't want me to be injured. I'm taking this personally for a silly reason. There's no reason for me to take this personally. So then I began to realize, she's giving me feedback. I'm hearing feedback. This is all feedback. So I had this eureka moment. And then once I made that realization and began to be able to recognize feedback in my personal life, it filtered over to the professional and actually made these things a lot easier. So I would challenge you to start recognizing feedback in your personal and professional life. As I said, it's happening all the time, whether you recognize it or not, and it will continue to happen. Like if you're driving down the road and someone beeps at you, guess what? That's feedback. That's feedback, right? Okay. So if you look in the medical literature, there is essentially not much at all in the medical literature on receiving feedback. There's one paper that I found that's really good on receiving feedback. Most all of it is written from the point of view of the educator giving feedback. But lucky for us, there's this great book that is written by Stone and Heen, and they are two faculty from the Harvard Business School. And in this book, they also actually have a paper which is essentially a distillation of some of the concepts from this book. So you can Google that, HBR, Stone and Heen, and find it pretty easily. They have identified 3 triggers that block the message of feedback. The first is a truth trigger, and this really refers to the message itself. So there's something wrong with the message. Has nothing to do with who is sending it. It's all about what you're hearing, and there's no way it's true, and there's no way it applies to you. The next trigger is a relationship trigger, and the relationship trigger has everything to do with who is giving you the message. Everything to do with it. So how dare this student of mine say that my lecture needs improvement? That's just, you know, how would a student be able to judge my lecture? That would be a relationship trigger, okay? And we all know we can all improve, right? All right, identity trigger. Identity triggers are triggers where we feel like our very core, our values are under attack. And the one I like to use about myself is professional attire. So if someone were to say to me, Dr. Bean, you really don't look that professional today, I would say, really? I would feel really tiny. So how do we overcome these feedback triggers? Well, the first thing, as I said, is to begin to be aware of when you're receiving feedback and how you respond. So become mindful of the whole feedback process and recognize it when it's happening, not only in your personal life, but also in your professional life. Disentangle the what from the who. So when you're getting feedback, when you yourself are receiving feedback, think about what is being said and who's saying it, and then focus on the what, if you are someone who has a problem, especially with relationship type triggers. Invariably, feedback and evaluation become commingled. And when you hear evaluative language kind of bundled with feedback, well, there's not much you can do about an evaluation because the judgment has been made. But what you can do is take that feedback information and use it to your benefit. So sort the feedback from the evaluation, clarify as necessary. And this is one of my favorite things that I do. The first time I did it, I really threw the people off. And this idea comes directly from Stone and Heen. The idea is ask for just one thing. So how many of you have gone to your annual faculty review, performance review, and they say, great, excellent, keep it up. You're on target. Maybe 2 years, 3 years from now, we're going to have you assemble your dossier, put you up for promotion. Excellent. Is that helpful? No. No, it's not helpful. We want to know, what can we do better? Are there major areas of deficiency that we need to work on? Let's hope not, but if so, we especially need to know about that. And if there are minor areas that we need to work on, we definitely need to know about that, because we want to be the best for our patients, our learners, and ourselves. And the only way we can do that is by hearing what we need to work on. So if you're in that situation and they say, great job, keep up the good work, excellent, outstanding, you're the best, my rock star, look at them and say, can you tell me one thing I need to work on, please? Tell me just one thing. And in doing that, you give them permission to tell you that there's something that you need to improve. And remember, we were talking about one of the reasons why we always only hear positives is because we want to be liked. Well, our supervisors also have that. They also come to that relationship with the same lens, the same human lens. And then you can engage in small experiments. So based on your observations of the information that you're receiving, make small changes and then observe what happens as a result of your small changes. If it's working, great, keep it. If it's not working, that's okay. Take two, you can try something different the next time. In the end, feedback is a gift. And as a receiver of feedback, we have the power to receive it, keep it, and use it. Receive it, keep it, not use it, or not use it at all. And so that's one of the powerful things about this relationship, is that we don't have to use the information. Now, I would encourage us as educators and as receivers to always try and keep and hear and listen and make good informed decisions if you're going to reject feedback. So the components of the effective feedback from the high power view, again, include environment, and that's the physical and the psychosocial environment. Learning goals, we're using our two types of feedback guidelines, guidelines for giving, guidelines for receiving, and we're making a learning plan. And when we come down to low power, you'll remember that our feedback is best occurs within the context of an educational alliance that we're forging as learner and educator together. So in conclusion, I will remind you that feedback is integral to learning. So we cannot self-assess accurately. We all think we're terrific drivers, right? We're not. We're not all great drivers. Establish educational alliances. And as I said, I know this can be a challenge depending upon the curriculum structure that you're teaching and learning in. But insofar as much as it's possible, When you are having that connection with your learners especially, forge these alliances and build on them. And in doing that, model humility. Let them know that it's okay to be wrong and that you yourself have been wrong. Share your mistakes. I think it will make for a more open and honest relationship. And then finally, label feedback. When you're giving feedback, use the feedback word. So at this point, I'd like to congratulate you all on your inaugural Education Day, for showing up for Teach Academy. This is really incredible, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. Thank you for having me. Your campus is very beautiful. Everyone's been so warm and welcoming. And I'd love to take your questions, comments at this point. Thank you.